Okay, I'm going to give you my laydown on steelheading, and steelheading. When you go bass fishing or something, there's several different techniques you can do: topwater cranks, such and such. Steelheading, you got basic three: bobber, side drifting, back trolling. Bobber fishing, I enjoy bobber fishing. You don't have to have a boat to do it. Everybody can go down and do it. So there's a few keys with bobber fishing that I do that some people don't. I'll just kind of give you the basic gear laid out. We'll talk about the jigs. We'll talk about a little bit of location stuff in terms of what to look for. You hear people say, well, steelhead, and this year it's been phenomenal. I've had a buddy of mine, when I first met him, 3 years he'd been trying to catch steelhead and hadn't caught one. And it was just a matter of he was doing everything right. He just wasn't in the right area. He wasn't doing the right thing. Okay? You always hear it, 90% of the fish, 10% of the area. Well, the river's long, there's fish all through it, but they'll concentrate in certain areas. And their movements are dictated by what's happening around them, their conditions. Is it cold? Is it clear? Is it flowing slow? Is it dirty and high? That changes how you fish. And that's the biggest key in understanding how to catch the steelhead. So let's just start with a basic setup, guys. I don't truck a lot of gear into my seminars because go buy what you want to buy. I'm not here to push gear to you and say, hey, buy this. All right? I own a tackle store. Everything in my tackle store I use. Okay? Basic rod setup. First thing that people will go do is they'll go buy a $200 G Loomis. Great, if you got the budget, have at it. And you can go buy a $50 rod. It's going to do the same thing. 8.5 to 10 foot. I personally like an 8.5 foot rod. It's just less weight in my hand all day as I'm making all my drifts. All right. The reason why I say don't worry about fancy rods with a bobber is because your indicator is the float, correct? When you're side drifting, you need to feel that slinky or that drop weight tapping the bottom, and then you can sense the strike, correct? You wouldn't want to take this big old limber noodle, medium, slow action rod out side drifting, because you're not going to feel a thing. You want fast action. You want medium heavy, but fast action. You guys all understand what action means? Slow action rod. See how that's basically going to bend from by my thumb, reel seat out? A fast action rod is just simply going to bend at the tip. And that's what you want for sensitivity. Bobber fishing, we don't care. We don't need sensitivity. The float's showing us everything we need. All right? 8.5 to 10 foot just allows you to make a big cast. You make a big cast, you make a big float. It allows you to get the hook set when you get down a long ways away from you. You got more leverage that way. Can you catch them on a 6-footer? Sure. 8.5 to 10 works best. For the reel, this is an old Mitchell Spider, guys. I've had this thing for years. I've got $200 spinning reels that I use for drop shot and everything else. For steelhead fishing, you want something in a size 3 or 4. If you look at a lot of reels, they'll say, like an example, the Cardinal, 501, 502, 503, 504. What does that mean? Well, 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are your sizes. For sensitivity fishing, you'll never see me drop shotting or shakying for bass with a spinning reel any bigger than a size 1, because I don't want the weight. Weight takes away sensitivity. We don't have to be sensitive with this setup, correct? Because the bobber's doing it for us. So a reel of a size 3 or 4, fine, whatever works. As long as it's got a nice smooth drag, that's the only thing I can tell you. Don't get something that's rickety and don't have a smooth drag, because you're going to be breaking your line with this setup that we got here. All right? So a size 3 or 4 reel. Biggest thing that I do different, and it's starting to catch on, and I hope that it catches on with all you in here, and maybe all you already doing it, has to do with the main line that you run. Everybody out there for many, many years has always ran monofilament line, correct? What happens? You know that red block, there's a rock there and there's a deep pocket, and I know there's current moving around it, and I know there's fish behind it. So we cast up, which we're going to get into why. We cast up quarter, we bring it down, we set the float to bounce around the rock and then down through the drift, right? As it's bouncing around and doing its thing, you're trying to keep tension, keep slack up out of it. When you first get out there and start fishing, that monofilament will float for you. But mono's like a sponge. As the day progresses, it gets heavier and heavier because it's becoming condensed with water. So it starts to sink. So then what happens? You're making your nice float down through there, and your line gets caught, and your bobber lays down, your jig swings out. You're constantly trying to mend. You're moving the float a bunch. Those are things you don't want to do. You get a bite, you go to set the hook set, and your line, you set the hook and the float is here, and the line goes like this when you lift up on it. Right? Have you had that happen before? All right? Here's what you got to do. Anytime you're float fishing, now P-Line, I'm not sponsored by P-Line, but P-Line makes a floating mono. I've been asked a million times on my internet site, have you ever used it? No, I haven't. This is a setup I like. What this is an 8-pound test Berkeley fire line. It's a fabric. It's lighter than water. It does not become saturated with water. I throw this out. I can now make nice gentle mends, pick the line up off the water without moving the float because we want a nice fluid drift. I can pick it up, pass it down in front of me. When it gets down in front of me and starts heading downstream, I can flip my bail and simply shake my rod tip. Very fine diameter, no drag coming through the guides. It flows down through the drift smoothly. When a fish bites, I'm always ready like this as it's going down. As the float sinks, I flip the reel, set the hook. Zero stretch. Zero stretch here. If I make a drift with this and I go down 80 yards, which is possible when you're drifting down there on the clear water, you can do it, no problem. When I set the hook with mono, if I go from here to that door and I start pulling on it with a 12-pound test, I'm going to go that way probably 10 feet before it breaks. All right? This is zero stretch. So I'm getting a positive hook set to my offering down there. So it's not causing the line to drag and go under. It's floating on top, fluid drift, I get bit, I set the hook, I got the fish. Now, if you have a rod that is a medium heavy, zero stretch is your enemy. Because now what happens, you start horsing a fish, all of your power is going into your leader. Because you have to run a leader with this. So here's the next step of this. You all know how to rig up a float, correct? Okay. Some people, if you have bad eyesight or you're starting to lose your eyesight, what I've got is you put a bobber stop on, and that dictates the depth you're running. You slide it up and down. Then you've got a bobber stop bead right here that goes up against your knot and stops it when the jig falls down. And then to that, I don't do it, but what you can do to that is put a corky on there, a chartreuse corky, right in between these two. And what that does is shows you that your jig is all the way down to the bottom. You see that corky sitting up on top of this. Now this float right here is a West Coast float. Uncle Walt's used to make one for White's Outdoors that I loved, and they don't make them anymore. And it was called a White's float, and it was a dual stage float. I reluctantly made the switch over to these. They're a foam float. There's no weight here at all. So what you have to do with these, when you buy one, you'll see on the package it'll say 1 ounce or 3/4 ounce. What that is doing is telling you what the operational range of this is. You got to have 3/4 of an ounce to make it stand up. If you don't, it's going to lay flat on the water. When you do it right, one, you got to have the weight to cast it. It pulls the jig down. It sets the float right about that high. And what it does, that 3/4 of an ounce preloads that float to where any little interaction from a fish, it pulls it down and they don't feel the drag of this. Now, I know you guys all use those, I've seen them, the big, I call them atomic floats. They're about that big around. They got about 2 ounces of weight on the bottom, and you go, bloosh, when it hits. Okay, I've seen them many times. And on the North Fork of the Clearwater, which I've fished for many years before it became popular, I would stand up there, and I always walked in on the roadside. Not the roadside you drove in, but there's a spur that goes up that way. And I always walked in there. And you're up high, and you would see these guys cast across, and you'd look down in the water in there, and you'd see 5 or 6 fish, 10 fish, or whatever sitting in the hole. And these guys throw these big atomic bobbers, and they land right on that red square instead of way up above. As soon as that thing hits, the sea just parts. Those things go like this. It floats on by, and they go right back in. You see it happen. You can sit there and watch it. It's like clockwork. What this does is a low splash, not a lot of commotion, because when we're bobber fishing, the water is low and it's cold and it's clear. And the fish are a little bit spooky, all right? So what we have to do to this is we have to add weight to it. So Sportsman's Warehouse carries these little guys, 3/8 ounce, 1/2 ounce, whatever you need. And this weight here, guys, is dictated by the float, but it's also dictated by how fast your water's moving. The faster the water's moving, the more weight's required to get it down. What you have to understand is that if you were to cross-section the water and cut the river in half and look into the river, your surface water is moving the fastest. As you go down, it gets slower and slower and slower. That's why the fish are down low. They don't have to fight as hard to maintain. All right? So the faster the water, the more weight's required to get it down and to make your system go. So you get these guys. I got a tie on each end. And what I do, just for precautionary, is I throw another small bead right here before I tie this weight on. Now what that does, if you make a cast, after time these things can stretch out sometimes or get caught around your knot. Then you throw it out and the thing's not going down on you. That just prevents that from happening. So we've got our weight, which matches this. Then what I do is I'm a light line fisherman. Any of the shows that you watch that I do, everything I do, I try to do it with the lightest line possible, because in my mind, if I can make it look as natural as possible, I'm going to have more strikes. I run an 8-pound test, fluorocarbon leader. 8-pound test. And you trust me, you can land them with it. You can. Everybody thinks you got to have 12, 15 pounds, winch on it. Light line. If you're not confident, go 10-pound. It's fluorocarbon. When it hits the water, it's got properties to help make it invisible. But 8-pound test gets me my most strikes. This length right here is going to be dictated upon how long your rod is. If you've got a shorter rod, can you imagine trying to cast that with 4 feet out there? You're not going to be able to do it. So I like to run, this is about a 5-footer right here. 5 to 6 feet with an 8.5-foot rod. I just swing it around, load it up, toss it out. The reason why I run this longer leader like this is because I do not want this weight anywhere in that fish's path when it's coming down. They're going to see it up above, and those fish are going to be 8, 10, 12 inches off the bottom, and they're looking straight ahead. Well, they may see it coming up here, but the focal point gets down on this bright colored jig coming at them, or the scent coming off the jig. I don't want this thing 10 inches away from them. I want it up high and away, so I know it's not causing a disturbance. Then down to here, and we'll get into jigs, we've got our jig tied on. All right. Now, what you have to understand about bobber fishing is that they'll eat a jig. I don't care if it's a summer steelhead on the coast or it's a winter fish in here. You can catch them down there in August at the mouth of the confluence fishing with jigs. They'll always eat them. But your most productive bite when you're doing a bobber and a jig is going to be in the dead of winter when it's slow, low, and clear and cold. Okay?